I spent years hiding in filthy basements, listening to the war cries above me, and what happened when the silence came still haunts me. People don't understand that. They imagine the end of a war is like the end of a storm, a sudden relief followed by the smell of wet earth and the promise of a new day. For me, the end of the noise was the beginning of true horror. The sound of bomb, the rattling of wall, the drone of planes that seemed to tear the sky in half, all of it was a familiar kind of terror. An enemy you could hear approaching. It was a monster that screamed your name before attacking. But the silence, oh, the silence was a sneaky predator. It arrived without warning, infiltrated the cracks in our rotting wooden door, and suffocated us with a calm that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any explosion. Because in the noise, we were merely victims of a greater force, cowering in the dark, waiting for good or ill. In the silence, we were forced to become participants, to face what was left of ourselves and the world. And what I saw, what I was forced to do in that stillness, was infinitely more destructive than any bomb ever dropped on our city. Our world was a 20-by-20-foot hole beneath our house in Charleston, South Carolina. The air we breathed was a thick mixture of the musty smell seeping from the stone wall, the odor of our unwashed bodies, and the acrid stench of the bucket we used as a latrine in the darkest. I was 17 when we descended into that hole for the last time, and 18 when the door opened to the silence. My mother, Martha, had aged 20 years in 12 months. Her hair, once a vibrant brown, was now a web of fine white strand, and her eyes had lost that sparkle of someone who believes in tomorrow. Beside me, huddled under a threadbare blanket, was my younger brother, Sam. He was only 10, and his only crime was being born in the wrong era. He spent his days drawing on scraps of cardboard with charcoal we scraped from the wooden beams, creating a fantasy world where soldiers were heroes and the sun still shone. I looked at those drawings and felt my chest break. He was still trying to find beauty in hell, while I had already given up. War, for us, was an auditory presence. We didn't see it. We heard it living and breathing above us. The ground shook with the passing of tanks, a tremor that rose through the soles of our feet and settled in our bones. The upstairs windows, or what remained of them, rattled with the impact of artillery, throwing small shards of glass and dust down at us through the cracks in the floorboard. We learned the language of our destruction, the sharp, rapid sound of a rifle meant imminent danger. The long, descending whistle of a mortar was the roulette wheel of death, where you simply prayed that luck wouldn't fall on your number. We became experts in fear, and in all our whispered prayers, we asked for silence. Just one more day, God, my mother would murmur, clutching the wooden rosary in her hand. Give us the peace of silence. Irony is one of fate's cruelest tools. We receive what we ask for. One Tuesday afternoon, the bombardment that had lasted 48 hours ceased. A final, more distant boom echo, and then nothing. The ringing in our ears was the only thing breaking the vacuum. Sam looked at me, his wide eyes a giant question. My mother stopped praying, her hand frozen in mid-prayer. The silence was so absolute, so heavy, it seemed to have a physical presence. It was as if a leaden blanket had been thrown over our city, and beneath that blanket, something terrible was happening. We didn't know what it was, but we could feel it. It was the fear of uncertainty, the certainty that the curtain of chaos had closed to reveal an even darker state. In that silence, I didn't find God. I found proof that he had abandoned us. My name is Jacob Holloway. Today, I am an old man of 87, with hands that tremble and a memory that sometimes betrays me, forgetting what I had for breakfast. But the memory of that basement, the memory of what came before and what followed, is as clear as a shard of glass. It doesn't fade. Back then, I was just a 17-year-old boy, skinny and gangly, with more dreams in my head than muscles in my arm. We lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and if you've never been to Charleston before all this, well, I'm sorry. You missed one of the sweetest melodies the world has ever composed. Our city wasn't just a place on the map, it was a state of mind. The salty Atlantic air mingled with the sweet scent of magnolias and jasmine overflowing the garden. The cobblestone streets of the old town echoed with the sound of horse-drawn carriages for tourists, a slow, steady rhythm that dictated our lives. On Sundays, the bells of St. Michael's Church didn't just call for a mass, they sang over the city, a song of peace and tradition. My life was as simple and predictable as those chimes. My father, David Holloway, was a carpenter. He wasn't a man of many words, but his hands spoke for. They were large, calloused and scratched, but capable of incredible delicacy. He taught me to feel wood, to understand its grain, to know when to push and when to give in. Wood is like people. Jacob, he would say, the scent of sawdust permeating his shirt. Every piece has its story, its imperfection. You don't fight them, you work with them. He was teaching me to build cabinets and chairs. Little did he know he was giving me the tools to try to rebuild a life from the rubble. My mother, Martha, was the heart of our home. While my father built the outside world, she cultivated our inner universe. Our house on Trout Street had a small backyard. There she kept a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Roses, hydrangeas, tomatoes that turned so red and sweet they looked like candy. The smell of her kitchen was the first thing that greeted me when I returned from school. Fresh, bread baking, Sunday stew slowly bubbling on the stove. She was the embodiment of security, of warmth, of the certainty that no matter what happened outside, inside there would always be a warm meal and a hug. And then there was Sam, my younger brother, 10 years of pure chaotic energy. Sam was a comet with blonde hair and scraped knee. He lived in a state of perpetual wonder at the world. A shell on the beach, a cargo ship in the harbor, a lizard on the garden wall, everything was cause for a barrage of questions and excitement. My job, as his older brother, was a mixture of protecting and tormenting him. We fished off the pier, played baseball in the street until Mrs. Gable complained from her window, and on warm summer nights, we lay on the grass in the backyard, and I pointed out the constellations our father had taught. His life was a book of blank pages, ready to be filled with adventures. The war stole his book and gave him only a lump of coal and a dark basement to draw his ghost. My clearest memory of that time, of that stolen life, is the last 4th of July we spent together as a whole family. We went to the Battery, the oceanfront park, with a picnic basket my mother had packed. Fried chicken, potato salad, watermelon slices so juicy the juice dripped down our chin. We sat on a plaid blanket, feeling the ocean breeze. My father, normally so reserved, was relaxed. He told me stories about his own father, gave me sips of his beer when my mother wasn't looking, and ruffled Sam's hair until he laughed. As night fell, fireworks began to explode over Fort Sumter, painting the dark sky with vibrant colors. I remember looking at my mother's face, lit by the red and gold flush, and seeing a smile so pure, so full of contentment, that it became the image I would conjure in the darkness, just to remind myself that happiness had once been real. In that moment, we were invincible. We were a family. We were America. A perfect illusion. The change was subtle at first. News on the radio of conflicts in other states, which seemed as distant as the moon. Then, the National Guard began patrolling the street. The city's festive atmosphere was replaced by a palpable tension. Neighbors stopped chatting about the weather and began whispering about food supply. One day, my father came home from work early, sat at the kitchen table, and announced he had enlisted. He said it was his duty to protect us, to protect the life he and my mother had built. I didn't understand. Protect what? By leaving. I felt anger, a knot of betrayal in my stomach. My mother wept silently that night. He left 2 weeks later, on a train full of other men with grim, frightened faces, trying to appear brave for their family. That was the day the foundation of our house began to crack. War arrived in Charleston not with a bang, but with the lonely sound of a departing train whistle. The first real bang came months later. A siren cut through the early morning air, an alien and terrifying sound. We ran to the basement for the first time, stumbling in the dark. And there, arms round each other, we heard the dull thud of the first bombs falling on the outskirts of the city. That night, our basement stopped being a warehouse for junk and tinned goods. It became our world. Life as we knew it was over. We were just waiting to see what would rise from its ashes. The first months in the basement were a macabre dance with fear. Every explosion made us cringe, every burst of gunfire a reminder of our fragility. But human beings have a terrifying capacity to adapt to horror. Acute fear, over time, became a low, constant hum, a part of our existence. What took its place, what became the true tyrant of our captivity, was hunger. Hunger is not like fear. It doesn't come in waves. It's a constant presence, a worm churning in your stomach, a fog in your mind that makes every thought but food secondary. Hunger has a smell, the sweet, metallic odor of your own body beginning to consume itself. And it has a sound, the hollow echo of your stomach in a silence that, back then, was still filled with the noise of war outside. Hunger stripped us of our dignity long before any enemy soldier had the chance. She turned us from a family into a small pack of hungry animals. The first victim of this transformation was not one of us, but the decency that bound us together. My mother, Martha, waged a private war against hunger with the same determination with which she tended her garden. She was the general of our ration. In the beginning, we had the shelves of canned goods she had prepared the previous summer, jars of green bean, pickles, tomato. They were relics of a world of abundance. She rationed them with surgical precision, a quarter of a jar of beans each for lunch, to crackers at night. We ate in silence, chewing each mouthful dozens of times, trying to trick our bodies into feeling full. But the shelves emptied at a frightening rate. Soon, meals became a thin soup made with the last moldy potatoes and the salt water in which the pickles were preserved. It was a cloudy, tasteless liquid that only made the hunger more a reminder of what we didn't have. At 17, with a body still trying to grow, I felt hunger like physical torture. I'd lie in the dark, listening to Sam's stomach growl soft, and my own stomach would respond with painful. I'd dream of my mother's fried chicken, of warm bread, of a simple apple. I'd wake with my mouth full of saliva and my heart full of cold despair. The breaking point, my first great humiliation, came over a can of canned peaches. It was the last sweet thing we had, the last tangible reminder of a happy summer. My mother kept it like a sacred treasure, high on the shelf, reserved for a time of dire need in her optimistic mind, to celebrate the end of it all. To Sam, that can was a symbol of hope. He spoke of it in whispers, as if it were a promised Christmas present. When the noise stops, we'll eat the peach, right, Jacob? He would ask me, and I would lie, yes, champion. All of them. But hunger doesn't care about promises or a child's hope. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The worm in my stomach was gnawing at me. I waited until the sounds of my mother's and Sam's breathing became deep and regular. The only sound in the basement was the slow drip of water from a cracked pipe somewhere in the darkness, a ticking clock measuring our decay. I rose with a care a thief would envy. The dirt floor was cold beneath my bare feet. Every step was a gamble. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by a sliver of moonlight that filtered through a crack in the ceiling. My eyes, already accustomed to the dim light, found the outline of the shell. I reached out, feeling the cold metal of the can. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure I would wake. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The plan was to eat just one piece, just one, to silence the beast within me. Using the tip of an old knife, I pierced the lid. The sound sounded like an explosion in the silence of the basement. I froze. I waited. Nothing. With trembling fingers, I picked up a peach slice. The texture was soft, almost heavenly. I brought it to my mouth. The taste, oh my God, the taste. An explosion of sweetness, of sunshine, of summer. It was the taste of the life we had lost. The worm inside me turned into a lion. One bite wasn't enough. I ate another and another, shoving them into my mouth with savage urgency, the soap dripping down my chin, the sticky juice on my fingers. I wasn't savoring anymore. I was just filling a seemingly bottomless fork. I ate almost half the can before a shred of reason returned to me. What had I done? The horror of my act hit me with the force of a fist. I put the can back on the shelf, the crime half hidden in the darkness, and returned to my mattress, the sweet taste in my mouth now sour with shame. The next morning, hell came in the form of my mother's silence. It was Sam's birthday. She had planned to give him the peaches as a gift, a glimmer of normalcy amidst the chaos. I saw her stand and walk to the shelf with a small smile on her face, the first I'd seen in weeks. I saw her smile falter and then disappear as she picked up the can and felt its weight. She turned, not to me, but to the center of the room, and opened the can in the dim light. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She glanced at the can's content, then looked up and met my gaze. Hers wasn't anger. If it had been, it would have been easier. I could have faced the anger, but what I saw in her eyes was a disappointment so deep, so ancient. It seemed to come from the very soul of humanity. It was the look of someone watching their child, their creation, transform into something they don't recognize. In that look, I was no longer Jacob, Hassan. I was just another creature of war, a hungry thief who would steal her own brother's joy for a moment of relief. She silently picked up a spoon and fed the remaining peaches to Sam, who ate them happily, oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded. And I stood there, watched by my mother's broken gaze, feeling humiliation burn inside me. That day, I didn't lose a battle against a soldier. I lost a battle against myself. And I realized that war would destroy us from the inside out, long before any bombs. The shame of what I'd done to the peaches settled in our basement like a fourth inhabitant, a cold ghost that sat between my mother and me. Her silence was a weapon sharper than any bayonet. She continued to feed me, to care for me when the cold shivered, but her eyes pierced me. I had stolen more than food. I had stolen the image she had of me, of the son my father had entrusted to her to protect the family. That despicable act marked a turning point. It was the moment when the horror ceased to be merely an external force bombarding us and began to grow within, like a cancer. The basement, already a physical prison, also became a psychological torture cell. And as our small family unit disintegrated into darkness, the outside world seemed to sense our weakening and decided to up its ante, tighten the sea, and show us that hell, in fact, had many other, deeper levels. The war was about to show us its true face, and we were too young to even blink. The first change was in the sound. We were familiar with the symphony of artillery, the chords of mortars, and the drum solo of heavy machine guns in the distance. But then the orchestra changed. The deep, distant sound was replaced by sharp, dry, and terrifyingly close crack. It was the rifles. The war was no longer being fought between anonymous armies in the fields round Charles. It had reached our street, our sidewalks. I heard the gunfire in short, furious, often followed by screams. They were human screams, not the mechanical whizzing of a bomb. They were the sound of men dying just feet from where I hid. With the rifles came the boots. The sound of combat boots running on the asphalt above, sometimes alone, in desperation, sometimes in unison, and organized, menacing. They stopped, ran, stopped again, and we, underground, held our breath with each. Do they know we're here? Did they hear us? The war had ceased to be an aerial event, and had become a ground. It had legs, and those legs now ran over our heads, turning the ceiling of our basement into the floor of their battlefield. Sam, who had previously been frightened by the explosion, now seemed even more terrified by those sounds. A bomb is impersonal. The boots are not. The boots belong to someone who could, at any moment, decide to kick down our door. Then our house began to die. First, it was the upstairs window. One afternoon, a sharp shattering sound rained down on the floorboards above us, and a fresh draught of cold air began to snake down into the basement. Then a mortar shell, or something like it, hit the roof. The sound was unlike anything we'd ever heard. It wasn't an explosion, but a crushing impact, followed by a long, agonizing creak of wood splitting. Beams that had supported our house for 50 years groaned in protest. Dust and chunks of plaster fell on us like dirty snow, covering us, getting into our noses and mouths. My mother let out a small sob. It wasn't her house that was being destroyed. It was the body of her life, the skeleton of all her memories. Every sound of destruction from upstairs was an amputation of her past. We were living inside a corpse that was slowly being dismembered, and the smell of death began to seep in. First, the smell of burning. Then, Woolly smoke began to seep through the cracks, stinging our eyes, scratching our throats. The Gables house, a lifelong neighbor, was in flame. We couldn't see the fire, but we could feel it, smell it. The smell of old wood, fabric, plastic, and something else. A sickly, sweet smell that my boyish brain couldn't identify, but which my soul recognized as the smell of burning flesh. The wind had brought the screams from far away, and now it also carried the smell of what was happening to those who screamed. Time lost its meaning. There were no more days or nights, only periods of intense noise and periods of bearable noise. Sam stopped drawing. He sat in a corner, hugging his knees, his gaze vacant. His wide eyes seemed to have seen a century of pain. My mother began having whispered conversations with my father, as if he were sitting beside her. She told him about our day, about the lack of food, and asked him for advice. At first, I thought she was going crazy. Then I realized it was her only way to maintain a shred of sanity, to connect with a world where love and order still existed. I, on the other hand, sank into a pit of helplessness and guilt. I was the man of the house, but what could I do? I was a rat trapped in a hole, listening to the world being destroyed. The hunger, the cold, the fear, all of it was overshadowed by this terrible sense of uselessness. I would give anything for a chance to fight, to do something. But my only role was to hide and wait. You know, when I tell these things, it's not to shock. It's so the memory won't fade. Stories like mine, and those of so many others, only survive if they're heard, if they're passed on. It's hard work, reliving all this, but it's work I feel I must do. And if what you're hearing touches you in any way, if it makes you think, consider subscribing, leaving a like. Not free, but so the memory of what happened to families like mine lives on. So the echo of those cries isn't lost in time. The proof of how fragile our existence came on a moonless night. The fighting in the street seemed to have intensified. We heard a series of short explosions, grenade, I think, and then a tense silence. Suddenly, heavy footsteps on our porch. Not running, walking. 1, 2, 3 men, maybe more. They spoke in a language that wasn't ours. Guttural and harsh, we froze. The blood in my veins seemed to turn. My mother gripped Sam's arm so tightly he nearly cried out in pain. I put my hand over his mouth, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if I could see the wood. We heard the sound of our front door handle being forced. A metallic screech, a kick. The wood creaked. They were inside our house, inside the dying body. They walked down the hallway, their heavy boots making the floorboards. One of them laughed, a short, mirthless laugh. They were meters away from us, separated only by a layer of pine boards and a trapdoor hidden beneath an old rug. Each second stretched into an eternity. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. This is the end, I thought. They'll find the trapdoor. They'll go down. I stared at my mother and brother in the darkness. My only function, my only purpose in that moment was to die first. I would put myself first. It was the only promise I made to myself. Then, as suddenly as they'd entered, they left. Perhaps they were searching for something they hadn't found. Perhaps they'd been given an order. We heard their boots retreating down the street, and only then did I realize I wasn't breathing. We exhaled collectively, a shuddering, pathetic sound. We survived, but something in us broke that. The illusion that the basement was a fortress, that we were safe, shattered completely. We weren't survivors. We were merely the dead who hadn't yet been found. The final climb took place on what I think was a Thursday morning. The sky was grey, as usual. The fighting seemed to have moved a few blocks south. There was a relative calm, the kind of silence we now knew was only the prelude to something. We were gnawing on the last hard biscuits when the earth shook. It wasn't a tremor. It was a convulsion, a sound that came not from above, but from everywhere at once, a force that seemed to want to tear the very fabric of reality. The light from our single kerosene lamp flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. A deafening explosion, louder and closer than anything we'd ever experienced, threw us to the ground. The world turned to dust, noise, and pain. The basement walls buckled inward, and the ceiling above us split with a sound like 1,000 bones breaking. beams, debris from our life up above rained down on us. I cowered, covering my head with my arm, feeling the impact of pieces of our house falling on. The air became so thick with dust it was like trying to breathe sand. I screamed for my mother, for Sam, but the only sound was the roar of our house collapsing and a high-pitched, piercing ringing in my ears. Then the movement stopped. The noise faded to a final creak, and then silence. A different silence, a silence filled with weight. We were in absolute darkness, trapped beneath what had once been our home. The smell of damp earth and gunpowder filled the air. I tried to move, but something heavy pinned my legs. I called again, my voice a hoarse croak. "Mom, Sam." I heard a faint moan to my left. It was my mother. And then nothing. The silence that followed was the sound of our grave being sealed. The darkness that followed the collapse wasn't the familiar darkness of our basement. That was a soft, almost velvety darkness, filled with the familiar sounds of our breathing and the dripping of water. This new darkness was violent. It was thick, heavy, and smelled of torn earth, pulverized plaster, and the acrid ozone of an explosion. It was a darkness that pressed, that suffocated. The silence that accompanied it was equally unholy, broken only by a sharp ringing in my ears, the ghost of the sound that had buried us. For a moment, I thought he was dead, that this was the afterlife, a black, dusty nothing. But then the pain came, a searing stab in my right leg, pinned beneath a wooden beam. The pain was proof that I was still alive, and if I was alive, they had to be too. "Mother!" I screamed, my voice a scratch in my throat, muffled by the dust I inhaled with each gasp. The silence stretched for a heartbeat that felt like a year. Then a moan, faint, but there. "Jacob." Her voice was a rag, coming from somewhere to my left. "I'm here. I can't move." Relief was a wave that made me sick, but it was immediately followed by a new wave of panic, colder and sharp. "Sam," I called. "Sam." Answer. Silence was the only answer. A total, absolute silence, coming from the corner where he always stood. "Sammy!" I screamed louder, the urgency transforming my voice into an animal scream. Nothing. In that moment, a strength I hadn't known I possessed took over me. The pain in my leg became insignificant. I was driven by a single, desperate purpose, to find my brother. I began to riff, to push. The beam above my leg was heavy, but the adrenaline was a fire in my veins. I used my back, my arm, grunting with the effort, feeling the skin on my back scrape against the rubble. The beam moved, just a few inches, but it was enough. I pulled my leg free. Pain exploded from my calf to my spine, but I ignored it. I was free, free inside a tomb. I dropped to my hands and knees, trying to orient myself in the darkness. My hands touched dirt, rocks, splinters of wood. The space was different, smaller, the ceiling dangerously low in places. I was a blind man in a shaky mess. "Mom, where are you?" I asked, crawling toward her voice. "Here, Jacob." "My leg. I think it's broken. I'll help you, Mom. But I need to find Sam. I need light." A cruel joke. The sun might have been shining outside, but for us, it had been extinguished. Then the memory hit me. My father, years ago, he had placed a small metal box on one of the shelves, along with the canned goods. Inside were candles, some waterproof matches, and his old Zippo lighter. An emergency kit we always considered paranoid overkill. I began to group desperately along the wall where the shell, or what was left of them, had stood. My hands encountered broken glass shards, their sticky contents mingling with the dust. I prayed. I hadn't truly prayed in years, but I prayed in that moment, a feverish, selfish prayer. "Please, please, please." And then, my fingers touched the cold, rectangular metal of the box. It was dented, but intact. With trembling, bloodied fingers, I managed to open it. The smell of lighter fluid was the sweetest perfume I'd ever smelled. I picked up the Zippo. My thumb found the flint wheel. The first attempt produced only a single spark that died instantly. The second, the same. Panic began to choke me. "Come on," I whispered to the metal object as if it were alive. On the third try, a small yellow flame sprang up, hesitant, then steady. An island of flickering light in an ocean of darkness. The first thing I saw was my mother's face. She was covered in grey dust, except for the clean trails her tears had carved down her cheek. A massive wooden beam from the roof pinned her left leg to the ground. It was bent at an angle that made me swallow bile. But she was alive. Her eyes met mine, filled with pain and a terrified question she dared not ask aloud. I didn't answer. I brought the flickering flame of the lighter closer to the corner, Sam's corner, where he spent hours designing his better world. The light danced over a mountain of brick and plaster, the remains of our house's chimney. For a second, I saw nothing, just rubble. My heart allowed a split second of hope. Maybe he'd moved. Maybe he was somewhere else. And then the light found a dot, not Sam, just his hand. A small, dirty hand, jutting from the rubble like a tiny flag of surrender. And in his fingers, still clutched, was the piece of charcoal he used to draw. The sound that came from my throat wasn't human. It was the sound of something breaking forever. Nitrogen monoxide. My mother saw where I was looking, and the wail she let out was the sound of her own soul being ripped apart. I threw myself onto the pile of rubble, the lighter I'd abandoned on the ground. I began digging with my bare hand. The bricks scraped my skin. The splinters of wood dug under my nail. But I felt no pain. I felt nothing but wild denial. This isn't happening. He's okay. He's just trapped. He's waiting for me. I'm coming. Sammy, hold on. Your brother's here. I threw back the pieces of rubble with manic force, dust flying, blinding me. Finally, I discovered him. He was lying on his side, almost curled up, as if asleep. There was a nasty cut on his forehead, but otherwise, he looked peaceful. His small, dusty face was serene. His eyes were closed. I pulled him out onto my lap. He was so light. Sam, I whispered, rocking him gently. Sammy, wake up. It's over. We're going to eat the peaches now. But he was cold. A cold that wasn't from the basement. It was a definitive, final cold. Life was gone. I held him close, his small, inert body against my chest, and my world, which had already shrunk to the size of that basement, shrank even further, to the exact size of the void he left. I didn't cry. Tears felt like an insult, an emotion too small for the magnitude of that loss. I just stood there, in the near-total dark, lit only by the lone flame of a lighter on the ground, holding my dead brother, while the sound of my mother's sobs echoed from our newly sealed grave. The war had finally made its way in, and its first victim wasn't a soldier on a battlefield, but a 10-year-old boy and his drawings of a son he would never see again. Time, inside that tomb, stopped. There was no day or night, only darkness, pain, and the cold of my brother's body in my arms. I don't know how long I stood there, rocking him gently, whispering apologies he could no longer hear. I'm sorry about the peaches, Sammy. I'm sorry for all the times I didn't want to play. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, stronger. I'm sorry I didn't save you. Grief is an ocean, and I was drowning in it, letting the dark, cold water fill my lung, welcoming the end. It was my mother's voice that threw me a rope. Jacob, her voice was a spiderweb whisper, fragile. You can't stay there. You have to get out. I opened my eyes in the darkness, the lighter flame long gone. Her voice anchored me back to brutal reality. She was alive. She was hurting. And Sam was dead. Staying there wouldn't bring him back. It would only kill us too. A cold fury began to rise within me. A rage against the beam, against the earth, against the war, against... It was a rage that burned brighter than grief. With a gentleness I didn't know I possessed, I laid Sam's body on the ground. I took off my coat, threadbare and dirty, and covered him up to his face. It was a futile gesture, I know, protecting him from the cold he could no longer feel, from the darkness he could no longer see. But I had to do it. It was a final act of an older brother. I knelt beside my mother and relit the lighter. The light revealed the damage. Her leg was crushed under the beam, and the ground round her was dark with blood. Her lips were almost white. She was dying. I'll get us out of here, Mom, I said, my voice sounding strained, harder. I promise. The promise was one thing. The reality was another. I was an 18-year-old boy, weakened by hunger, with a wounded leg, trapped under the remains of my house with a dying mother and the body of my brother. I used the lighter to scout. The main entrance, where the trapdoor was buried under tons of earth and brick. Impenetrable. The stone walls of the basement had buckled in places but held for the most part. The ceiling, our former floor, was a chaotic jumble of broken boards, plaster, and unrecognizable wreckage of our furniture. The air was heavy, stale. Each breath was an effort. Panic began to bubble, the claustrophobic sensation of being buried alive. I stifled it. I thought of my father. Wood is like people, Jacob. You don't fight it, you work with it. I wasn't a carpenter, but I was the son of one. I began to look not at the destruction, but at the structure behind it. Where had the house been weakest? Where might the collapse have left a passage? My eyes were drawn to the north wall. That was where the small basement window had been, a bud opening at ground level, where coal used to be delivered decades ago. Now it was buried, but perhaps the earth there was looser. It was our only chance, one in a million. The hardest job of my life began. First, I had to free my mother. The beam was impossibly heavy. I tried to push it, to lift it, but it barely moved. I needed leverage. Fumbling in the dark, I found a piece of iron pipe, probably from our old boiler. Using a block of broken bricks as leverage, I wedged the pipe under the beam. I threw my full weight onto it. The wood creaked. "Hold on, Mother," I yelled. She let out a muffled scream as the pressure shifted on her leg. I pushed with a force born of desperation, my muscles screaming, sweat pouring into my eyes. The beam rose, just enough. "Now, Mother." Crawl back. With superhuman effort, she crawled, leaving a trail of blood on the dirt floor. The beam fell back with a thud. She was free, but the damage was done. Her leg was a shapeless mass of tissue and bone. I ripped off a piece of my shirt and bandaged it tightly to try to stop the bleeding. She passed out and woke up, her breathing becoming shallower. The clock was ticking. I left it in a relatively safe corner and began digging. The area beneath the old window was covered in loose dirt and smaller pieces of rubble. I started with my hand. The earth was cold and damp, full of sharp rocks and shards of glass. Within minutes, my nails were broken, my fingertips raw. The pain was a white heat, but I kept going. I dug with the fury of an animal trying to escape a trap. With each handful of dirt I threw back, I spoke. I told myself not to go crazy. I told my mother, mostly unconscious, about the picnic at the battery. I described the colors of the fireworks. I spoke to Sam, asking him to give me strength. I spoke to my father, asking him to guide my hand. I dug for hours. The lighter would stay lit for a few minutes, long enough for me to see my progress. Then I would extinguish it to conserve the fluid. The world shrank to that narrow tunnel, to the sound of my labored breathing, the smell of earth and blood, and the sensation of my hands being destroyed. There were moments when exhaustion overcame me. I would collapse, my head against the cold earthen wall, and the darkness would invite me to give up. "Just sleep," she would whisper. "It's easier." But then I would hear a faint moan from my mother, or the image of Sam's covered face would flash through my mind, and the rage would return, pulling me to my feet. Finally, something changed. The earth I was digging became drier, sandier, and then my hand hit something hard. Wood. It was the remains of the window frame. Heart hammering against my ribs, I began to clean round. The wood was rotten, crumbling at the touch. I opened a hole, a breath of air. It wasn't fresh air. It smelled of smoke, chemicals, death. But it was different from the stale air of our tomb. It was the air of the outside world. The hope was so overwhelming it nearly made me faint. I began to widen the hole with renewed energy, tearing at the rotten wood, pushing at the earth. A small ray of grey light, the most beautiful light I'd ever seen, penetrated the darkness. I poked my head through the hole. The sight that greeted me was the apocalypse. My street, the street where I played baseball and rode my bike, was gone. It was a lunar landscape of craters and destroyed buildings. The neighboring houses were blackened skeletons, sending columns of lazy smoke into the leaden sky. A car sat overturned and ablaze in the middle of the street. There was no sound of birds, only the crackling of the fire and an eerie silence that seemed to scream. I walked from one grave to another. My relief turned twice. Down the street, about 50 meters away, A patrol of enemy soldiers moved slowly through the rubble. They walked with arrogant exhaustion, their rifles ready. If they saw me, if they heard me, we would be dead. The climax wasn't the explosion. It wasn't being buried alive. The climax was that moment, trapped between a grave with a dying mother and my brother's ghost, and an outside world that was an active extermination camp, with death patrolling the street. I had escaped the trap only to discover it was inside a much larger cage. I pulled my head back in, my heart pounding wildly. What to do? Return to the darkness and wait for a slow death, or step out into the light and face a quick death? I looked at my mother. Her eyes were open, fixed on me. She couldn't speak, but I could read the play in her eyes. To live. The worst moment of all wasn't when the bomb fell. It was the choice I had to make next, knowing that either option was a death sentence, but that the promise I made compelled me to choose. With the sound of soldiers' boots approaching, I knew I had only seconds to decide the fate of our lives. Time contracted in that instant. The sight of the world outside a graveyard of rubble beneath a sick sky and the sound of soldiers' boots approaching froze my mind. I pulled myself back into the darkness of our hole, my heart pounding like a battle of Jericho against my rib. I crouched low, head down, dust and the smell of smoke filling the air around my head, while the rest of me remained in the stale, humid air of our tomb. The silence that settled there was not one of peace. It was the silence of prey listening to the predator approaching. Every crackle of a distant fire, every piece of metal that riffed as it cooled, every footstep on the street sounded like thunder. I became nothing more than a pair of ears, praying that the sound of the boots would continue, that they would pass, that they would ignore us. And they did. The heavy, steady rhythm continued down the street and slowly faded. Only then did I realize my teeth were clenched so tightly my jaw ached. I released a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding, and it left me in a shaky. The chaos of escape, the adrenaline of digging, the urgency to save my mother, all of it receded, and what remained in its place was a void so vast and deep it threatened to swallow me. I was free, but I had never felt so trapped. Outside, there was the danger of war. Inside, the weight of death. I turned to the darkness of the basement, and the scale of my personal tragedy hit me full force. Adrenaline had masked the pain, not just in my leg, but in my soul. Now, it flooded me. I looked at the still form beneath my coat. Sam, my little brother, the boy who drew suns in a world without light. The frantic energy to save him had drained away, leaving behind only the cold, heavy truth that I had failed. The silence in the basement was different now. Before, it had been filled with the absence of the noise of war. Now, it was filled with the absence of Sam. It was a silence that had weight, shape. It was the sound of laughter that would never be heard again, of questions that would never be asked again. It was the sound of the future being erased. I felt terribly, cosmically alone. My father, a ghost in a distant uniform. My brother, a cold body just a few feet away. My mother, a frail breath in the darkness, her consciousness ebbing and flowing like a weed. I was an island, the last piece of land of a family being swallowed by the sea. I crawled back to her. The grey light streaming through the hole I dug was enough to see her face. It was pale as wax. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved, forming silent words. I put my ear close to her mouth. She was reciting the names of the flowers in her garden, roses, vine, hydrangeas, blues. In her mind, in her delirium, she wasn't in a bloody basement. She was in her garden, on a sunny afternoon, her hands in the dirt. A silent tear slipped from my eye and fell onto her dusty. It was a scene of such painful intimacy, such broken beauty, that my heart sank. We'd fought so hard to keep the outside world out, but it had entered and was poisoning us, turning gardens into feverish deliriums and siblings into painful memory. The loneliness I felt in that moment was the purest I'd ever known. It was the loneliness of being the sole witness to the disintegration of one's own universe. No one else in the world knew that Martha Holloway was dying while dreaming of flowers. No one knew that Sam Holloway lay under a dusty coat. These tragedies were ours alone, invisible to the outside world, as insignificant as the dust dancing in the grey beam of light. The silence forced me to think. In noise, you just react. You cower. You wait. You survive minute by minute. But in silence, the mind begins to work. And my thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt and sadness. I had succeeded. I had carved a path out. And to what? To a world that was an even larger and more dangerous replica of the hell we left behind. The irony was overwhelming. I had spent years wishing the noise would stop, and now, in the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire, I would give anything to hear a bomb falling somewhere else, a sound that told me death was busy on another block, that it wasn't standing on my street, waiting. The stillness wasn't peace. It was anticipation. It was the predator holding its breath before pounce. I looked at my hands. They were unrecognizable, covered in dried blood and dirt, the skin torn and the nails broken. They were the hands of an old man, not a young man. They were the hands of a carpenter's son who, instead of building, had spent the day digging a grave, only to discover he had dug his way out of one and into another. The emptiness inside me was the answer to the question I didn't even know I was asking. What remains when everything is gone? The answer was you. You and the choices you make next. The silence gave me clarity. A cold, hard, hopeless clarity, but clarity nonetheless. There was no going back. There was no rescue coming. There was no happy ending. There was only me, my dying mother, and the promise I made. The clarity that silence brought me was sharp as a shard of glass. It cut me, made me bleed, but it also showed me the way. It wasn't a path of hope, not in the sense most people understand. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. There was only the tunnel, and the moral obligation to keep walking. The choice had been made by me the moment I promised my mother I would get her out of there. A promise made to someone who is dying is the most sacred of all. It's a contract signed with one's own soul. I looked at her face, serene in her unconsciousness, and at the shrouded form in the corner. Two promises, one I could still try to keep, and one I had already broken. And it was there, in that moment, that the first lesson of my new life was forged. Strength isn't the ability to prevent tragedy from happening. It's what you do after your world has already been shattered. It's the will to pick up the pieces, even knowing they will never fit together the same way again. My father was a builder. He created order from scraps of wood. Amidst the utter disorder, I felt a primal urge to do the same. I needed to get my mother out of there, and I couldn't carry her. Her leg was a wreck, and any sudden movement would kill her from pain or shock. I needed to build something. With the flame of the lighter, I searched our grave. I found the old basement door, ripped from its hinges by the explosion, but still intact. I found lengths of rope my father used to tie wood together. With an effort that strained every muscle in my body, I dragged the door toward her, carefully. With a delicacy that seemed absurd amid the brutality of the situation, I rolled her onto the makeshift stretcher. She let out a high-pitched wail that broke my heart, but she didn't open her eyes. I used the ropes to tie her loosely to the door, not to restrain her, but to prevent her from rolling if the stretcher tipped over. Each knot I tied was a silent prayer, an echo of my father's lessons on how to do things right, to make them last. I was building the most important vessel of my life from the wreckage of my world. Before leaving, I had to do the hardest thing. I knelt beside Sam's body. I lifted a corner of his coat. His face was calm. In death, he looked even younger. This wasn't my brother anymore. He was just the shell he'd left behind. The real Sam, the comet with blonde hair and scraped knee, was gone. "I'll come back for you, Sammy," I whispered into the silence. "I promise. I won't leave you here." It was the second promise of that day. A lie I needed to tell myself to be able to take the next, leaving one part of your soul behind to try to save the other. That was the second lesson. Sometime, survival is the cruelest act of all. I covered his face again and turned away. I couldn't look back. If I did, I would stay. Getting the stretcher out of the hole was a nightmare. It was a battle of inches, pushing, pulling, using my back and legs. I forced it up the narrow tunnel I dug. The earth crumbled round us. For one terrifying moment, the door stopped. I pushed with a scream of fury and despair, and it gave way. We were outside, under the grey Charleston sky. The world outside was noisy. Silence. The crackling of the fire, the moaning of the wind through the destroyed buildings, the distant hum of something that might have been a plane or just the sound of my own sanity fading. I began dragging the door down the street. The friction with the rubble was immense. Every meter was a victory. My vision narrowed until I could see only the next step. Drag. Stop. Breathe. Drag again. I wasn't thinking about soldiers, bomb, or danger. My entire existence was focused on that single act, moving my mother through the apocalypse. It was during this journey that catharsis came. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a scream. It was a silent understanding. I learned what hope was. Before that day, I thought hope was believing the sun would rise tomorrow, that things would get better, that the war would end. How foolish. True hope has nothing to do with optimism. It's an ugly, stubborn, and often irrational thing. It's the strength that makes you tie your dying mother to a door and drag her through a burning city. It's not the belief that you'll reach safety, but the absolute refusal to die there. Hope is an act of defiance, not a feeling. It's the middle finger you give the universe when it tries to crush you. And love also revealed itself. It wasn't the warm feeling of Sunday picnic. It was the weight of that door. It was the pain in my bleeding hand. It was the willingness to put my body in front of any bullet that might come her way. Love, at the end of the world, is not a word. It's a verb. It's carrying, dragging, protecting, fighting. Halfway there, she woke. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the feverish haze lifted. There was clarity. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice dry. "You look just like your father." She reached out and touched my face. Her hand was cold. He would be proud. And then she closed her eyes again. Those words were the fuel that carried me the rest of the way. Pride. My father. I wasn't just saving my mother. I was honoring him. I was becoming him. The final lesson sank in. Death takes everything from us. It takes our home, our families, our future. But there's one thing it can't touch. What we give to each other. The strength my father gave me, the love my mother taught me, the innocence Sam represented. I carried all of it with me. They were no longer by my side, but they were inside me. Death can take people, but it can't take what they've built inside you. This is the only immortality there is. I found shelter in the ruins of an old library. I dragged the door inside, out of sight of the street. My mother still breathed. We had survived. I hadn't won the war. I had lost almost everything. But I had understood. I had learned that life is not measured by what we avoid, but by what we face. And that in the heart of the worst horror, if you dig deep enough, you will find the purest, most unbreakable version of yourself. The library was a shrine to ghosts, books, the voices of 1,000 souls, lay scattered and torn across the floor, their stories silenced by the brutality of a single, largest. We found a niche behind a fallen oak book, a small oasis of relative safety in the desert of destruction. There, I laid my mother. The sky outside turned from grey to a sickly purple, then to black. Night fell, but brought no star, only a pulsing orange glow on the horizon, where the city still burned. That night, in the stillness of the dead library, my mother was gone. There was no dramatic last breath, no final words of wisdom. She simply stopped breathing. Her passing was as silent as the fall of a leaf, so subtle that for a moment I thought she was merely drifting off into a deeper sleep. I held her cold hand until dawn, the last guardian of her journey. I had fulfilled half my promise. I took her from the basement, but the world I took her to was not a place she could live. I was alone. The word alone is too small to describe what I felt. I was a period on a page ripped from a book, the last Holloway, the bearer of all memory, all pain. I survived, but survival is a strange victory. No one tells you it comes with a burden. The burden of remembering, the burden of promises you couldn't keep. I never returned for Sam. In the days that followed, I was swept away by event, becoming a refugee, a number, another anonymous face in the tide of humans suffering the war left behind. Our street, our home, became a forbidden zone, then just a memory covered by new building. The promise I made to my brother's body became the greatest ghost of my life. He's still there, in my mind, in that dark basement, waiting for me. And I'm still here, an old man, asking for his forgiveness every night. People celebrate survivors. They call us strong, resilient. But they don't understand what it takes to survive. They don't see the parts of you that had to be amputated so the rest could carry on. I left my brother in a grave. I left my mother's sweetness in a ruined library. I left my father's pride somewhere between the noise and the silence. What remained, what rose and kept walking, was no longer Jacob Holloway, the carpenter's son. It was something else, a creature born of dust and loss, shaped by hunger and shame. All of us in that war had something we held onto. For Sam, it was a piece of charcoal and his drawing. For my mother, the memory of her flower. Little things that reminded us of who we were. I wonder, and perhaps you can tell me in the comment, what is the little thing, the small object, that reminds you of home? What would you save if you had to leave everything behind? Sometimes thinking about this helps me remember that I once had a home too, before I learned that homes can become tombs. The war was over, they said, months after that. There were parades and speeches. But for me, the war never ended. It no longer lives in the explosions or the screen. It lives in the silence between my thoughts. It lives in the taste of peaches, which I could never eat again. It lives in the smell of damp earth after the rain. Sometime, when the world goes quiet at night, I still feel like I'm in that basement, hearing the screams from above. And the truth is, I don't think I ever left. I didn't come back from that war. I just learned to breathe outside of it.